So it's really prioritizing social and ecological needs of Colombia and making sure that we're eliminating profit considerations from the entire chain, from production, from transmission, from management, from efficiency, from conservation, and that the decision making, the public decision making, has, not profit, but people's needs at the forefront.
Hello, and welcome to Class and Climate, a podcast from the Green Economy Network and the Broadbent Institute, where we see how the end of the world meets the end of the month. I'm Nick Pierce. We'll start with 50%. That's roughly how much oil accounts for Colombia's export revenues, and despite that being a seriously substantial amount, Colombian workers and the progressive government of President Gustavo Petro are mounting a serious strategy to address global heating with ambitious climate plans targeting the oil industry. Now, in Canada, our exports are not nearly as dominated by oil. It accounts for about 16%, and most of that ends up in the United States, which we're currently in a trade war with. That doesn't stop the oil industry from endlessly threatening workers and their jobs at the slightest hint of climate action that could protect them and their communities in the long term. These threats are why Colombia is an inspirational example of what's possible in a tough situation when oil exports are held over workers' heads. What's more, the transition in Colombia is being led by workers. Today we'll be speaking about the Oil Workers Plan for Popular Energy Sovereignty in Colombia's just transition, which is being created by the Colombian Oilworkers Union, USO. To read briefly from the draft plan, it states, quote, "The public pathway to a just transition for Colombia is inconceivable without a strong class analysis that exposes and resists the capitalist imperatives fueling both ecological destruction and labor exploitation." We have the perfect guest to tell us more. Matt Kirkegaard is a political coordinator at Progressive International. Our other guest, Lala Peñaranda, is a Latin America coordinator for Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. Together, they explain why a class analysis is fundamental to understanding climate action. Progressive International's workshop in Bogota opened with the statement that energy is the principal geopolitical dispute of our time. From a workers' perspective, or I guess a progressive perspective that includes workers in just transition plans, like what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, I think it means a few things. One, that sovereignty is more important than ever in this geopolitical conjuncture. We're living in a time of great upheaval geopolitically, and particularly in the energy sector. Just to come out and say it, with the leadership of China, especially in green technology and battery technology and solar technology, now being confronted with the United States that has totally turned its back on most of those, and a Western world that is, increasingly turning its back on a lot of those technologies and leaning harder and harder into fossil fuels. So, for Colombian workers, this really means, taking on a protagonistic role, I think, in the just transition, not being victims or pawns of an international system that will take them where they will, but rather really becoming the motor of the movement to take energy sovereignty into their own hands, which the union already has a long history of executing. We can get into this later on, but USO, from its very founding and its historic strike in 1948, was the mother of Ecopetrol, of the national oil company, of the state oil company in Colombia. It was this strike, it was this union that allowed for and moved forward the nationalization of oil and the creation of the state oil company. Met with great repression and violence by international capital and and the state for all of the decades that followed that. But this leadership by USO again shows that it's the union, it's the workers themselves that are moving forward a different energy system, still ideally in public control, and that energy sovereignty has never been taken off the table. In fact, it's still the most important thing in this just transition. But it also means that internationalism is important. and this is especially for Canadian listeners and for Canadian unions, this doesn't mean, hiding behind national borders. This means standing with Colombian workers, for example, when they face repression by companies from the global north, when they try to chart their own path towards sovereign development for their country that is then stymied by interests from the global north. So it means internationalism and sovereignty, to sum up.
Lala, did you have anything to add to that?
I guess quickly that a lot of these concepts of just transition and green industrialization are up for dispute. Like, this is the kind of task of our time and of USO to change from rolling out the red carpet for multinational private corporations to now rolling out the red carpet for workers, for communities, for energy users. And so it seems like neoliberalism and its approach to energy transition globally have laid the foundation or the terrain for the dispute that we are now in. And part of USO's work is to denaturalize the market orientation of that just transition and to really give it a class analysis. And that is happening everywhere in the world. And it requires to know the names and last names of the actors, know the corporations, know their faces, know your enemy, and to really, chart what it will take to reclaim and restore energy for workers in a plan by workers.
So I guess in that spirit of internationalism, could I get like a crash course in USO and Ecopetrol? Like, give a Canadian listener like the ABCs of class politics in Colombia when it comes to oil.
Sure, yeah. So USO was founded in 1923. So it's over 100 years old. They just celebrated their centenary. And it was originally founded clandestinely as an illegal association, workers coming together to fight for their rights along many of the same lines that would be very recognizable to Canadian workers, for an 8-hour workday, for improved working conditions and improved wages, etc. But as I mentioned, in 1948, this also took on a much more national character. In what was called the Patriotic Strike of 1948, USO workers launched a mass strike that eventually led to the nationalization of oil. In addition to fighting for, in the same set of demands, improvements in their own working conditions, also fighting for this broader goal of Colombian sovereignty over their oil resources, over their oil and gas resources, which eventually led in 1951 to the creation of the state oil company, Ecopetrol. This is a company that the union has, in past decades, fought very hard to defend, died defending all through the Uribe years, which Canadian listeners may be familiar with, the Plan Colombia years, the hardest years of the war on drugs, during the Bush administration, for example, in the United States in the early 2000s. Many USO workers were martyred in their defense of Ecopetrol as a public company and their resistance to its privatization, which they succeeded in fending off at great cost to their own lives and livelihoods. But the union currently counts about 25,000 members, workers as its members. It's the most militant union in the oil and gas sector by far, though it's not the only one. And yeah, I guess we could also say that it's no longer just an oil and gas union. It's recently transitioned towards becoming a broader energy workers union, even though the vast majority of its workers still are in oil and gas.
As Matt said, this is one of the most persecuted unions in the country with the highest rates of trade union persecution. So, the Truth Commission that Colombia recently, or in the past few years, has assembled, documented nearly 900 victimizing incidents against USO union members. And this includes everything from homicides, arrests, harassment, attacks, kidnappings, torture to many who were exiled. And obviously in the 50s, as Matt was saying, up through the early 2000s, and even till today, we have comrades surviving assassination attempts. And the only reason really that USO survived throughout all these strikes and throughout all this repression is because of the coalition work that they did with the communities in Barranca Bermeja. And there was like a mutual protection of communities to Uso and Uso to communities. For example, Uso providing the only potable water source in Barranca Bermeja, free potable water source in Barranca Bermeja. And so in a just transition, to carry forward that coalition work will also be a make or break element. And where many, many other countries face a kind of communities versus trade unions, here they've had to depend on each other because of this history of repression. And then the other thing, just to complement what Matt was saying, is that this trade union was born from radical politics. It was born from the Communist Party, from the Socialist Party. And this is an ideology that created the base for arguing for a national company of oil that would benefit the working class of Colombia. And that history is in the DNA of Uso that is now charting a just transition. And that is, it's not liberal ideas. These are radical ideas for a time that frankly requires them.
Thank you so much for that context. And I guess to contextualize that further, this is also happening at a time with, I guess, a very interesting president in Colombia, President Gustavo Petro, who has attracted a lot of attention for innovative and creative approach to climate policy in the world, I guess. Like, could you just kind of give me an overview as well of President Petro's orientation and how he's approached climate politics?
So Gustavo Petro is the first left-wing president in the history of Colombia, presiding over the first popular government made up of support not only from trade unions, but also from peasant movements, from popular movements across the country, and who serve in his government as ministers, as vice ministers, as public officials. One of the key slogans of the campaign and of the government was to make Colombia a world power of life. This is something that the president talks about all the time, referring not only to ecological dimensions, but also its, the life-giving dimensions of what a government and a state should do. From his inaugural speech, Petro put debt for nature swaps on the agenda again, saying that, Colombia cannot be expected to bear the burden of climate policy as, at the same time that the global north demands massive debt repayments to the tune of, tens of billions of dollars. But it also has meant, very concrete things, the military deployment in the Amazon to stop deforestation and to stop forest fires. In the first year of his government, deforestation fell to a 23-year low. They've recently encountered more difficulties stopping deforestation, but they've also made great headway. Advancing renewable energy has been at the top of the agenda through lots of different policy mechanisms, one being the transfer of, or really the change in title of Ecopetrol from being just an oil and gas company to becoming an energy company writ large, with a mandate now not only to explore oil and gas, but to develop all of Colombia's energy systems and resources. But it's also meant, in the more discursive realm, taking up the banner of addressing the climate crisis from the South, especially at this moment when, governments from the North have essentially, abandoned climate as a topic that is now we hardly on the agendas of the North anymore after for so long it being allegedly at the top of that agenda. So it's been important, I think, for Petro to be a standard bearer for addressing the climate crisis with urgency at an international stage.
And I guess in Canada, it might be very familiar for a lot of listeners to hear energy exports sort of used as a cudgel to threaten workers, oppose climate action. Whereas in Colombia, energy exports are literally, I think, half of Colombia's exports. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And you hear this incredibly courageous leadership coming out of Colombia, which is very inspiring. And I'm wondering, I guess, why workers in Colombia seem to be on the vanguard of these issues, despite, I guess, these like the kind of clear and significant role that fossil fuels play in the Colombian economy. Like, why are Colombian workers so ahead on these issues over technocratic governments across the world, corporations, like they're on the forefront? Why is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's lots of answers to that, but this is the most important thing to keep in mind is that this is an issue of not only of environmental concern, but of national development. This is a question of how Colombia will move from, a primarized economy, an export-oriented economy. And I don't know if it's over half of the exports total, but it's half of the value of the exports, at least, are oil and gas exports. And how can an economy in the periphery, as Lala was saying, overcome just becoming another just the mine or the plantation at the service of a global economy centered in the north, and exercise sovereign development that industrializes the country, development that actually provides good jobs and wealth and decision-making power in the people of Colombia rather than in the shareholders of the North. So I think, USO, as we've discussed through its history, is incredibly well positioned to take up this banner, having fought for energy sovereignty and public energy sovereignty its entire existence, but also being very crucially positioned in the value chain as the workers that are making this wealth possible, that are extracting oil and gas, refining oil and gas, and delivering that to Ecopetrol and to the other companies exploiting the resources in Colombia. So, they're able to think, I think, more democratically, more, in a more forward-thinking and less profit-motivated approach, and to really understand what's best for Colombia and to try to chart that path themselves as the protagonists in this process.
And I think the history of the country has pushed USO in this direction. The fact that USO was at the forefront of fighting privatizations of governments that were hell-bent on serving multinationals, and specifically the United States government, really gave it a crash course from its inception in imperialism, in capitalism, and every stage of its fight has prepared it to really have a class analysis, an anti-imperialist analysis in the debates around the governance of natural resources, of who they're for the benefit of who, at the cost of who. And I think to have lost so many comrades, especially at the hands of paramilitary groups, and to have had those paramilitary governments be the same ones that privatized, I think under Uribe in total, there were nearly 500 state-owned companies that were either restructured, sold, liquidated, or reformed. And they knew that if they lost the fight and if Ecopetrol was privatized, that this would be for the loss of the working class. And so when the framework of a just transition comes into the question is, why are they so far ahead in their critical thinking than corporations? I think a green transition is just, in many cases around the world, especially in the global south, a pretext for the same structural adjustment, this time a green structural adjustment, but that they immediately recognize. And I think USO's bullshit radar is extremely refined, and they know whether it's painted green or whatever, that this is going to come at the cost of the Colombian working class, and that they will continue to be at the forefront of the fight to have natural resources, whether that's oil and gas or electricity generated with renewables, that this energy is for the working class, and that this is their mandate, this is their historic mandate, and this is the reason for USO's existence. And so I think you really cannot detach that class analysis from the DNA of the union.
So that sets everything up perfectly to talk about why I dragged you both into the Zoom call, which is the Oil Workers Plan for Popular Energy Sovereignty in Colombia's Just Transition. What is this document? What's contained in it? And I don't know, what's the best vision of where this goes?
This was a plan that USO identified as a desire to develop, and they reached out to Progressive International to help them develop it. And it's a plan essentially for USO workers by USO workers, which combines class struggle that's inherent in the climate crisis, and that offers a Colombia, version of the just transition. It is currently in a draft form. We're still going through the interviews. The process has been pretty extensive over the past 5 months of doing interviews with the leadership of USO, which includes the Junta Directiva Nacional, so the national elected leadership of the union, and then also the presidents of the subdirectivas of the union, as well as union members that are in the sort of studies or certificate programs on a just transition sponsored by USO in the public universities of Colombia. We also interviewed trade union members of ISA, which is the electricity transmission company that was purchased by Ecopetrol a few years ago under the Duque administration, and members of the different ministries, advisors, members of Ecopetrol. So it's been sort of a tour de force of interviews, leading up to over 130 pages of interview texts. And we knew that, this wasn't the first time that USO did a similar exercise. And so we really wanted to build on the work that had already been done in previous workshops, in previous assemblies. In particular, USO has had they're called Assemblies for Peace. So in the 90s, USO launched a series of territorial or territory-based assemblies that asked how can the hydrocarbon resources of Colombia be used to help support the development and like defense of peace with social justice in Colombia. And so they did 32 departmental assemblies. They, gathered top, I think it was 12 demands in a national assembly. And they've done, I have to say, so much work from the 90s about the governance of natural resources through today, but with the opportunity presented by not only the Petro administration, but a Minister of Mines and Energy that was the former USO president, Edwin Palma. So, you have this historic opportunity, and PI, I think, recognized that, USO, because of its exceptional history, really, had to be supported. The next steps are essentially to centralize the different feedback that we've gotten about this first draft plan, and to put forward a second draft that will then be voted on by USO and presented as a final plan. I think, central to the plan is the idea that many unions are facing a choice between an austerity vision and a politically ambitious vision. And an austerity vision is, how do we, protect our jobs? How do we maintain what we have and guarantee that we have the least number of job losses and losses of the benefits that we've fought so hard for, which is, all of those things are extremely valid. But when paired with an ambitious abundance political mindset, it's really the question of how can a just transition not only protect the hard-fought victories that we've won, but really strengthen and expand the membership of USO, strengthen Ecopetrol, ensure that Ecopetrol, as a state-owned company, which is 88% state-owned, leads on the just transition rather than the private sector. How do we ensure that it leads in the just transition and including in the green industrialization of Colombia? So we have better jobs in sectors that have a higher value added, that ensure not only energy sovereignty, but economic and political sovereignty, and that guarantee that these new jobs that are often, in the renewable energy sector that are extremely precarious, are unionized, have high labor standards, and ensure benefits to the communities that have really rarely seen benefits from extraction of energy or the presence of energy multinationals in the case of especially coal mining. And so I think that was the vision of PI and USO, to really take on not just workers' rights, but also these more ambitious elements of technology transfer and public procurement and public-public partnerships and regional integration and value-added, supply chain development and research centers based in public universities and public institutes of Colombia, that wherever this uncertain future leads us to, that Colombia is prepared to respond to it, because we have a labor workforce that is highly trained through public education. I think that's, a little bit of the why this plan came to be. And Matt, I don't know if you want to compliment.
Yeah, I mean, as Lala emphasized, this is not the government's plan. This is not, the PI's plan. This is the workers' plan. This is really the plan developed by and for the fossil fuel workers of Colombia, in represented in USO, in their most combative and I would say radical union. So I think it's a really path-breaking document that is instructive not only for other actors within Colombia, but also at an international level, putting forward ideas, marrying the twin problems of the energy transition and sovereign development, and charting a path out of those dilemmas with worker protagonism and justice for workers that have suffered so much on the front lines at the hands of fossil fuel companies. This is something that I think it would be incredibly important for other unions to engage with outside of Colombia, outside of the South even, including in Canada. So we look forward to more dialogue nationally about this plan in particular and the ideas in principle that it sets out to achieve. And that's partly why, in our international workshop, we brought experts not only from across Colombia and government officials from across Colombia to feed in and comment on the plan, but also from the UK, from Canada, from the United States, from Brazil, from Ecuador, from Argentina, and beyond.
Right. So I guess part of my question is this public pathway to a just transition being described. I guess to a certain extent, it might vary depending on the national context. Colombia is obviously different from a place like Canada and the global north. But are there some common ingredients, some things that a public pathway tends to include, whether it's in Canada or Colombia?
So the public pathway refers to a general pathway, and it will look different for every sector and every country to transition towards public ownership of energy and democratic control of that public ownership. And so usually, the assessment has a few steps of how to design that public pathway. It includes, for example, identifying key neoliberal laws in the energy sector, in the power sector, that were passed during, the neoliberal or structural adjustment period in a given country. And then also identifying any subsequent laws that were sort of shaped by neoliberal motives. So in Colombia, for example, Law 142 and 143 of 1994, which really imposed neoliberalism, particularly on the power sector. And then seeing for the hydrocarbon sector and for the power sector, to what extent in Colombia was the kind of World Bank's standard model of privatization imposed and enforced. So was Ecopetrol or were the large power companies unbundled? Was transmission privatized? Are independent regulators designed and created to favor private companies in the market? Did they remove price controls? And then what has been the pushback legislation introduced, in Colombia or in Canada or in any other country that tried to counter those early 90s, 2000s neoliberal policies, and identifying, was the pushback sufficient? Did it do its job? Can it be supported? Or is it so watered down, this pushback, this original pushback, which tends to have happened in many countries, that really we need to replace it altogether? Also, what is, identifying, and I think this is the first step, right? Identifying the actors and some of the ongoing in 2025 neoliberal influences. And, in the trade union sector, and I really can't emphasize this enough, there are so many think tanks and NGOs that exist primarily to demobilize, depoliticize, de-radicalize trade unions. And so really identifying those, which often, promote independent power producers as a green way to, decarbonize our economies. And then the sixth point is really, what has been the trade union response? What has been the organized resistance? And that question leads to, okay, how can we strengthen that trade union resistance? How can we strengthen the trade union alternative? And when we talk about the alternative to the neoliberal or market-based energy model, we're talking about the public pathway, creating a public pathway. So trade unions are supporting this multi-year and sometimes decades-long process that involves renationalization, demarketization, decommodification, and democratization. And demarketization and decommodification are ones that maybe I'll just really quickly spell out a little bit.
Yeah, could you define
So,
those?
yeah, so demarketization, refers to the fact that in the 90s, public companies were required to operate as for-profit commercial enterprises, and so engage in full cost recovery. And to engage in a process of demarketization really includes, among other things, to create new performance criteria. So it's not profit maximization, it's not maximizing returns to investors, but creating a criteria by which we can measure a public company's meeting of its public mandate, that is, to meet the needs of its people. And, decommodification follows a similar train of thought where it's not, again, to profit maximize, but to really, if we're going at overhead cost, but we are guaranteeing the right to electricity, we are responding to energy poverty, we are responding to energy access inequality, then this company is meeting its goals and should continue to be invested in, modernized, made more efficient. And that's something that we have not seen in private companies around the world. So decommodification really entails ending the practice of tying revenues and profits to the sale of energy, for example, in the power sector, to the sale of electrons by volume, with no social, no ecological value to energy conservation. It incentivizes price manipulation. It discourages the production of needed electricity below certain volume thresholds. So it's really prioritizing social and ecological needs of Colombia and making sure that we're eliminating profit considerations from the entire chain, from production, from transmission, from management, from efficiency, from conservation, and that the decision-making, the public decision-making has, not profit, but people's needs at the forefront.
Thank you, Lala. That was amazing. I guess a great rundown of this. I think I want to ask what lessons the Oil Workers Plan has for workers in the global north, like in Canada. I think one of the really inspiring things about this document is how much worker voice is embodied in it. You were describing all the interviews being done, all the inputs from like people up and down the union. How can we sort of translate that sort of workplace and economic democracy into the global north when we're talking about the energy transition?
Well, there's lots of points that can be taken up by workers in the global north. I mean, one of the key embodying, rather than a particular policy point within the document, is the spirit that again USO embodies and that we've been talking about for this interview. The idea that workers themselves have the power to change the energy system and to fight for a public energy system, to fight for a just and an ecologically sustainable energy system. These are things that are absolutely within the remit of worker organizations, of worker power, and that unions in the global south have been leading on for a long time now. And that it's, this is something that unions in the global north should absolutely take inspiration from and lead themselves. It's not enough to just request that your elected representative do X, Y, and Z. It's not enough to sort of content yourself with the political conjuncture where, many of our governments find themselves in the global north. It will be up to workers in the workers' movement and an internationalist workers' movement to support one another in the struggle to combat the climate emergency, but also to maintain worker power in our industries. So for Canadian workers, this might mean more militant action, more political demands beyond a simple wage increase or improved working conditions. It means more social demands. It also means, as Lala said, working hand in hand with communities alongside unions that USO has drawn so much strength from for decades. So these are some of the, I think, if not policy points, animating spirit of the document that the North needs to, also take up. As far as some of the policies themselves, A lot of this revolves, and I know you've covered this on the podcast before, Nick. Revolves around industrial policy, and taking up new industrial policy for the benefit of workers and union power, but also towards a green transition, using the power of the state to actually change our industrial matrix, our energy matrix. This is something that we've done before, that can be done again, and that this document absolutely encourages, especially on the Colombian.
Yeah, and I would just add, many, especially as the far right and flat out fascism kind of spreads across many countries in the global north, it's really important to remember the example set by USO that fought under right-wing authoritarian paramilitary conditions for many decades. And that I think if you had told me or any other Colombian 10 years ago that we were going to have Gustavo Petro as our president, it would have been, yeah, and pigs can fly, and I think that the lesson there is that organized workers must be prepared with their vision and with their, alternative to the status quo. So when the conditions align, we're ready to go. And it was essentially rage through the form of a national strike in Colombia that led to the election of Gustavo Petro. And it's that rage that is going to get us a just transition in Colombia or in Canada. And there are a few examples of global north countries that have designed their own public pathway approaches to a just transition. FNME CGT of France has a really great plan, and so does KCTU and KPTU of Korea, both, focused on public ownership. And I think that those are great case studies to look at. And then also just the basic premise that people over profit resounds everywhere, across every country, because we have so much more to win through robust publicly owned services in a just transition than through whatever they are offering us. I think the DSA in the United States has done a great job tying a just transition to winning public housing that forms part of a just transition with solar panel energy efficiency, remodeling, actual meeting the laws of temperature and like NYCHA housing, for example, but also winning public transport, which is one of the best ways to decarbonize. And frankly, one of the best ways to better the daily lives of the working class across our cities and countries. It's cleaner air, it's better public schools, it's dignified labor conditions for care workers, which is another sector that probably under a just transition, it's one of the main ways to decarbonize, and also to respond to the public healthcare crisis linked to the just transition. We need more, we need public healthcare. We need especially, across the global south and in the United States. And so USO's main lesson is that we have so much more to win if we fight for our vision of a just transition rather than take lying down what they are offering us, which is hell in a climate crisis.
Thank you. It's great to hear, especially as a lot of Canadian politics seem a little bit bleak in terms of the energy transition right now. I want to close on asking, I guess my previous question was what can Canadians take from Colombia, but I guess this is the reverse. How can Canadians contribute and act in solidarity with Colombians, the global south more directly, or more generally, I should say, to support workers no matter what country they are from and sort of embody the kind of internationalism we're talking about?
Yeah, I think what may not be immediately clear to perhaps many of your listeners in Canada is that countries like Colombia are under constant attack by the institutions and the powers of the global north. Be that in an IMF structural readjustment to privatize new industries or extract more wealth out of the public coffers of a country like Colombia, or through direct violence, as we've discussed already about how much the workers of Colombia have suffered at the hands of paramilitary forces, in many cases armed and trained by the United States government, and through its alleged war on drugs and covert activities across Colombia, or through the support of outright interventionist policies and geopolitical strategies from countries of the global north. Of course, the United States is the main offender here, and Canada plays a sort of a secondary role. But, I'd like to draw the attention, for example, just to Canadian mining corporations, which are incredibly active across Colombia. And that's just a few years ago, were suing the government of Colombia for roughly 10% of its budget, over, dozens of billions of dollars. Colombia has managed to win a lot of these fights, but these are fights that seek to essentially extract money, of course, but really extract the sovereignty of the Colombian people over their own resources. To get a little bit into the weeds here, it's the system known as ISDS, the Investor State Dispute Settlement System, whereby basically corporations can sue governments for impeding on their profits, and there's no recourse the other way around. For example, Canadian corporations sued the Colombian government for billions of dollars when the government decided that one of its ecosystems called páramos, which are basically high Andean plains regions where most of the potable water of Colombia comes from for cities like Bogota, the capital city. A regulation came into place that banned oil, gas, and mining operations in many of those páramos. And a Canadian corporation was affected and responded by suing the Colombian government for billions of dollars. Fortunately, they haven't gotten everything that they've wanted, and Colombia has been, surprisingly victorious in some of those fights. But it's ongoing, and these aren't suits that take place in Colombian courts. These are suits that take place in Washington, D.C., at a corporate tribunal with, international arbiters, one of which is appointed by the company suing itself. So, this attempt to extract Colombian resources come hell or high water, and to not allow the democratic and sovereign will of the people and its government to impede on the collection of those profits, this is baked into the system. And, Canada and Canadians can show a lot of solidarity with not only Colombians, but with folks across the global south. The same thing is happening in Ecuador right now with the negotiation of a new free trade agreement with Canada to block these provisions, to not allow ISDS provisions in new trade agreements, and instead to support the free and sovereign development of countries in the global south rather than impeding it and trying to extract more profits. So that's very specific, but I think it's something that's important to highlight, and that has affected largely energy and mining workers and energy and mining communities in Colombia.
The only thing I would add is to not underestimate the interest that the Colombian trade union movement has in the Canadian trade union movement. There's, because of the involvement of Canadian companies in Colombia, as Matt just described, there's so much interest in Colombian workers being contacted by comrades in Canada. So if you are listening to this and you're in a union, reach out to us, reach out to USO, reach out to the mining trade unions, because they want to work with you. They want to hear from you. They want to conspire with you. And I think, there's so many events happening in Colombia around a just transition, and it would be really meaningful for more Canadian trade unions to participate in those meetings, to participate in those workshops, and then not just as a one-time event, but really to follow the process of building this just transition, which, again, I think the working class of Canada and Colombia have more in common than the ruling class of Canada, than they do with their own Canadian ruling class. So this is the bread and butter of building what PI has been promoting as the new international economic order, and particularly the new international energy order. We need Canadian workers to coordinate with Latin American workers if this transition is going to be just, if it's going to be internationalist, if we're going to fight these privatizations. So yeah, more coordination.
You're here. Thank you guys both, Lala and Matt, so much for joining us today. That was terrific, and I learned a ton. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks so much, Nick.
That's it for me, Nick Pierce. This is the final episode of Class and Climate that I'll be hosting. Thank you to all who listened to the conversations we hosted on the show, the Broadbent Institute for its support, and our guests who offered a snapshot of what working class climate action could mean in Canada. I'll close with another quote from the Colombian Oilworkers Plan, which I think embodies the best of the work put out by the Broadbent Institute and the Green Economy Network. Quote, Workers, through their unions, have the power to lead this transition, fusing ecological goals with territorial justice and demands for fair wages, secure jobs, and the collective good. Green industrial development is not merely an environmental imperative. It is a means to challenge decades of neoliberalism's consequences in Colombia, as well as build a future in which workers and communities across the country hold power over how energy and resources are produced, shared, safeguarded, and used.
Class and Climate is a joint production of the Green Economy Network and the Broadbent Institute. It is hosted and written by myself, Nick Pierce. Clement Nokos created its theme music and edited the show. Jack McClellan contributed show notes and promoted it. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please share it with a friend. You can find our other episodes online at perspectivesjournal.ca.